This is a video lecture for Chapter 1 of the Criminological Theory, Context, and Consequences textbook. This will just cover kind of an overview of some of the information in the first chapter and the goals of the course. So the main goal of this course is to take a look at the efforts different academic people have made over the decades to explain why crime occurs. And it's really a more complicated question than most people give it credit for, because we're really talking about human behavior. So when we talk about why people do the things they do, why they make the decisions they make, sometimes there just isn't really a good explanation for that, or at least it's very difficult to figure out what the explanation is. Sometimes news commentators and people on TV try to make this much more simple than it really is. What you'll find as you progress in your study of criminology is that there are very few things that are simple, because the problems that we study are just very complex problems. Crime is actually a pretty rare occurrence in our country if you consider the big picture. It's still a serious problem and it deserves some study, but you always need to remember that crime rates and the incidence of crime is actually far less than most people believe that it is. In fact, one of the things that surprised me the most when I first started working as a police officer was actually how little crime there really was, and how much of a police officer's time was spent really just doing nothing, waiting for something to happen. And actually it occurred to me many times that people could get away with committing a lot more crime than we actually have, but a lot of people just choose not to. So it's kind of an interesting thing, but you need to keep in mind the context that we're talking about and how rare of an incidence crime really is. But one of the reasons that it's so serious is because even though major crimes are rare, the cost that they generate, both personal and financial and to our society, is very high. And so that's why it's a problem that deserves our study. One of the main ways we track the incidence of crime is through what we call the UCR data. Stands for the Uniform Crime Reports. These are statistics that are published by the FBI every year, and where they get the information from local law enforcement agencies all over the country. And actually, law enforcement agencies aren't required to participate in this program, but most do, where they basically upload all of their data to the FBI every so often, and the FBI aggregates all this information that comes in from all over the country, and they put it all together and publish the Uniform Crime Reports. So this gives us some kind of an idea of what the incidence of crime is in our country for a variety of different types of crimes. For example, about 16,000 residents are killed annually through some sort of act of crime. About 1.2 million Americans are robbed, raped, or seriously assaulted every year, and about 9 million houses are burglarized. So that's a lot, and those are big numbers, but again, remember the context. We have over 300 million people living in this country, so the fact that 1.2 million of them are seriously victimized every year by those crimes you see listed there is actually pretty good, because that's about 1/3 of 1% are your chances of actually being victimized by one of those things. So again, it doesn't mean that we shouldn't try to reduce it even further and that we shouldn't address it, but just remember that in the big picture, a lot of these serious violent crimes are actually pretty rare. There are some criticisms of the UCR data, and there are valid criticisms, and you need to know what they are. And keep in mind that even though the UCR data have weaknesses, it doesn't mean that we can't use them. When you're using these types of data, you just need to understand what they are actually representing. Because the UCR data really represents reported crime. Because the only way anything gets recorded in the UCR is if someone calls the police The police show up, and then they write a report. Even if you call the police, but they don't write a report, well, then there's no way for it to get in. So it's really a reflection of reported crime. We know for a fact that not everybody, or not all crimes are reported. A lot of crime goes unreported. So it's universally recognized that the UCR data underrepresents the amount of crime that occurs in this country. It probably underrepresents the crime rate in our country, but it does give us some kind of an indication of what's going on, because we can estimate, maybe how much crime was unreported based on the amount that was reported, and you might be able to come to some kind of a figure. But we can never really know the exact crime data for sure, because we're not ever going to have every crime reported. But so again, the UCR is useful, but you do just need to understand what it represents. The FBI statistics also don't include drug-related offenses. Now, when police officers write reports, they do, note those offenses. It's just that the FBI doesn't include that for whatever reason in the UCR. So really, it's just information on street crime, not some other types of crime that's out there. So looking at crime in the United States, again, even though, like I said, crime is rare when you consider the big picture, it is a prominent feature of our society. Crime, we hear about it all the time. Everybody seems to know somebody that was victimized or they were victimized. So crime is still a prominent feature of our society. And actually, some of our crime problems here in the United States, especially when you look at violent crime that involves death, the United States really surpasses most other Western industrialized nations. So it is a problem that is worth looking at. Another thing you need to know about crime in our country is that it is not evenly distributed. It's not just like you find a certain amount of crime in every neighborhood. Crime is concentrated in pockets of geographic locations. And this isn't hard to understand. Most of you will understand that, you probably when you were growing up, your parents told you, oh, that's the bad neighborhood, this is the good neighborhood, or whatever. And no matter where you live, you probably are aware of areas that are considered high crime areas and other areas that maybe are not considered high crime areas. And that's, again, because of this idea that crime is concentrated in certain areas. And then even when you look at what we call high crime areas, within those neighborhoods, you can see that crime is concentrated in those neighborhoods in certain locations in the neighborhood. It's not just uniformly distributed throughout the neighborhood. So it's kind of interesting. And when I was policing, I worked in the south end of Cobb County. In general, the south end of Cobb County is a higher crime area than most other parts of the county. But even within that area, we had certain places that we knew were kind of the crime hotspots, where everything happened, is what we said. For example, the Six Flags Drive area has a lot more crime that we had to handle than, say, over in East Cobb County, which is a wealthier area, which is a very low crime area. So, crime is concentrated in different locations. So looking at theory now, you might ask, well, why would we even bother with theory? The main reason we bother with theory is because we'd like to try and explain why we have this phenomenon that we call crime. And if we can figure out why it happens, then the idea is maybe we can figure out how to stop it, or reduce it at least. Most people believe these factors that you see here, bad family life, unemployment, overly lenient courts. A lot of people will cite things like that as being some of the main causes of crime. And while it's true that those factors may contribute to the problem, those by themselves are not sufficient to really explain what's going on. And a lot of these ideas are not drawn from research. Most people don't spend their time reading crime research. They just read the latest news story. And one of the things that you have to start to get out of the habit of, if you're going to be a professional in this area, is that you have to leave these kinds of preconceived notions and personal biases behind. Because if you only analyze this type of a topic through your own personal biased lens, and we're all biased in some way, you're not really going to come to the right answer. And so it's important to be open-minded and to be grounded in the research on this topic, because really well done research is what gives us at least what is closer to real answers about why this problem exists and how we can deal with it. One of the things we need to recognize is that people's thinking about crime is usually influenced by their own life experiences. And this is part of the bias that I was talking about earlier. I can't tell you how many times I've talked to people, especially when I was a police officer, who, immediately when they found out I was a police officer, wanted to tell me about the last time they got pulled over and got a ticket, and usually it ended with, and the cop was a jerk, and so therefore I believe that all cops are jerks. Well, not all cops are jerks, and maybe even the cop that treated someone like a jerk wasn't really a jerk. Maybe there was something else going on that caused him to act that way. Maybe he was a jerk. But we can't let our personal experiences influence how we think about these types of things too much, because one person's experience does not reflect all of reality. If we really wanted to know if police officers were jerks or what percentage of police officers were jerks, we would probably need to conduct some research, interview lots and lots of people who had interactions with police in a variety of different circumstances, ask those people to rate the officer's jerkiness, and then we could probably come up with some kind of an estimate as to how many police officers were jerks. And then we would probably also have to say, well, and some are bigger jerks than others. And so again, that's the type of research that you need to do if you really want to get the answer to a question. You can't just let one experience that you had, or that Uncle Joe had, or your mom or your dad influence the way you think that reality is actually reflected. So this problem isn't just a problem with the general public. It's also a problem with politicians, because the politicians are the ones actually making policies about all this stuff, and if they let their own personal biases get in the way of this kind of thing, then we end up with policies that don't work. And policies, once they're put in place, can be costly. They can actually do damage if they're not good policies, and it's difficult to get them repealed. So keep in mind as we go through this course that the way you think about crime has undoubtedly been influenced by your own experiences and the experiences of your friends and relatives. But try and think past that. You have to get out of the mindset. This is what we call egocentric thinking. Your experience does not reflect reality necessarily. Now, it might reflect reality, but we don't use one person's experience or even 10 people's experience to make some kind of a statement about reality. We can only try to make statements about the way things work through careful research, and theory is usually the basis of this research and guides the questions we ask and how we go about answering them. Even if a theorist only is just kind of, thinking about what might be the causes of crime, it's important to realize that even these ideas might be used to direct policy efforts to do something about crime. And so a theory is only good in terms of policy implications if we can test it and it actually works. There have been several theories over the years that people came up with. Some of them you just couldn't test. There was no way to test the theory because of the way they were constructed. It was just too complicated. So if we can't test a theory to see if it's right, then it's really of no use. If you can test it and you find that it really doesn't work the way you thought, then you probably shouldn't be making crime policy based on that theory. So it's important to keep in mind that just developing a theory is nice, but we also need to test it, and we need to see if it works or not. And only when we understand, in some measure, why crime is occurring, only then can we really have a good conversation about strategies to control crime. Another thing to think about when it comes to theory and policy is that different theories will suggest different ways of addressing the crime problem. Some theories have as the root cause of crime the way the system treats people. So that would suggest reforms to the criminal justice system. Other theories might suggest that it's bad parenting that makes people become criminals. And so that would suggest we probably ought to intervene in children's lives and their parents to teach them how to be good parents. So, and a lot of different theories out there have merit, and they all suggest slightly different ways of addressing this. And theories of crime change over time. We update them as we do research and learn new things. And hopefully, as our understanding of crime changes, criminal justice policies will also change. Another thing to keep in mind too is that sometimes the societal context or the political feeling of the time may have a lot to do with what policymakers do or don't do. And you might have a theory that's, let's just say you had a theory that was 100% right, but for whatever reason it kind of ran against the current political wind. It's probably not going to go anywhere even though it's right. So these are things we have to contend with when we're looking at converting answers we get from theory into policy as well. The theme of the textbook that we're using for this class is the interconnection between the social context, theory, and policy. That's really what this book is aimed at. We do need to learn the theories and what they say and how they work, but it's also important to realize that theories don't just exist in a vacuum. A lot of theories come about because there are things going on politically or socially that make those ideas popular. And then once we have a theory that maybe has a little bit of merit and we think is on the right track, those theories influence policies. And so it's important to realize that theory is just kind of one step in this chain of events that occurs when we're making policies. And the primary purpose of the book that we're using is to give you an introduction to criminological theory and which theories are the most popular. The book will also cover a lot of theories that are kind of sideline theories, and a lot of them are theories we don't really talk about much anymore, but a lot of them have ideas in them that led to the mainstream theories of today. So it's important to understand where those all come from. This is just a quick overview of some of the chronological development of theory. I'm not going to run through this now. You can look at that later, and I believe this chart is in your book. But just realize that there is an evolution to how theory is developed, going all the way back to the 1700s up until today. And some of the ideas from the 1800s and 1700s still persist, even in the theories that we use today. We've just refined them in a lot of ways. But you can see here, we're going to go through all these different stages of theory development, and by the end of the book, we will have hopefully brought ourselves up to date on what's going on in this area. To just give you a brief rundown on some of the major schools of thought that have come and gone in the criminological theory area, the first really big idea that took hold was what we call the classical school of criminology. And if you go back to the 1700s and early 1800s, what dominated was this idea that we call spiritualism. Because again, back then, governments were largely controlled by the churches, and the church was everything. It controlled everything that was going on. And so the explanations for crime back in the 1700s and early 1800s was simply that if you were a criminal, it's because you were possessed by the devil, or you had an evil spirit in you that was making you commit these bad acts. And so they would then subject you to various physical punishments and spiritual ceremonies that were supposed to rid you of these demons. So that line of thought actually persisted for quite some time. But then during the Enlightenment period, some people came along that said, no, we don't really think that's right. And actually there's really no way you could even test it, even if you did think it was right. If you wanted to construct a research experiment, I'm not sure how you would test for demons. But they said, no, we believe that people are rational decision makers. They analyze the costs and the benefits when they're making a decision, and if something will benefit them, they will do it. And if it costs them too much, then they won't. And that was the basic idea behind the classical school, that people were rational decision makers, and they made their own choices and analyzed costs and benefits and then moved on. So we'll talk about some theories that grew out of that school of thought. That dominated for quite some time, and then a new line of thought came along that we refer to as the positivist school. The word positivist, you have to understand where it comes from. It refers to the positive application of scientific principles. That's all it means. All it means is that this was the first scientific effort to study crime and criminals. And people in the positivist era essentially took the idea that they kind of got rid of this idea of people being rational decision makers. They essentially said people are affected by their environment, and it may also be affected by their genetics. There were some early not really genetic, but biological types of experiments they did. But essentially, the idea here was that criminals and non-criminals are different, and so they thought, well, if we use the scientific method, we can determine what those differences are, and then we can isolate criminals and cure them or whatever ails them. Originally, this idea focused on biological traits, and you'll read some about that. It was Lombroso was the guy who was mostly associated with that. And it didn't really pan out, but they were just doing things like measuring the bumps on your skull, looking at the width of your arm span compared to your height, things like that. And none of that really panned out. And in the end, they kind of tossed those ideas out and said, man, this isn't really working. So even though some of the ideas they looked at seem silly to us, the application of the scientific method is what led them to conclude, no, these are not what's causing people to commit crime. And so it's actually a good thing. Because they actually figured out one thing that was wrong, and so then they could move on to just figure out something else. So these are the two major ideas that dominated in the early development of the field of criminology. When you get later on into the 1940s and 1950s, there are some other branches of scholarly thought that spawned some new theories. One was called the Chicago School, and again, don't get too bogged down right now in the details on these things, because these are things we're going to talk about much more in depth later on. This is just a brief overview. But the Chicago School was a group of professors working, guess where, in Chicago, and they came up with some different ideas, and they were looking at crime really more on a macro level. They were looking not at individual characteristics, but characteristics of communities and cities, and trying to figure out what is it about these areas of concentrated crime that causes them to be that way. Some of those ideas also led to the creation of what we call control theories, differential association theories, and enemy and strain theories. And again, these are categories of theory that we'll spend more time on later. But these branches of theory really are still kind of the mainstream theories in criminology, and they've been the dominant line of thinking for many years. And you can't get into criminology these days without looking at these areas. Another branch of theory that we talk about is what we call critical theories, and this really came about around the 1960s. And again, talking about political and social context, the 1960s were an era of great unrest. There was a very high level of distrust for the government. The things that were going on in this period were the women's rights movements, the Vietnam War, shootings at Kent State by the police, the Watergate scandal and the Richard Nixon administration. And so there was a lot of tension between the public and the government, and the public didn't really trust the government at all, even less than they do now. And so that spawned what we call critical theory, which really kind of examines this power imbalance between different groups of people. And that kind of spawned some theories. The main one is labeling theory, conflict and radical theories, feminist theory, and white-collar theories. Now, just so you're aware, we are actually not going to cover in any great detail some of these critical theories. We'll talk a little bit about some of the major ones. But feminist theory is kind of a specialized area that isn't really well suited to an undergraduate theory class. You can learn a little bit about it, but it's really hard to get into it a great deal because it's just so diverse in the different types of things it talks about. White-collar theories we're also not going to really spend any time on, because there is an entire white-collar crime class that is part of the criminology program that will give you what you need there. So we're not going to spend a lot of time on it in this class. In the 1980s, Ronald Reagan was elected president, and that's usually what people point to as being kind of the beginning of a big conservative movement. And it wasn't just in crime policy, it was in all kinds of areas in our government. And in terms of crime, we call this the conservative era. Really, what we saw during this time period was a return to more punishment and harsher sanctions, because it was believed very strongly that the reason we had such high crime, and crime was higher then than it is now, the reason for that was that we were being too lenient on people. It was believed that if we put people in prison for longer time and we punished people more severely, that would prevent people from committing more crime in the future. Now, we'll talk about later that actually turned out to not be true, but it was based on the best thinking at the time, and that's what they decided to do. And that's partly why we ended up with such a huge prison population that we have today. If you look at prison populations, going back 80 or 90 or 100 years, they were actually pretty constant for a long time. It didn't really change that much. And then about in the early to mid-1980s, you start to see a pretty steady increase in prison populations until you get to where we are today, with a little over 2 million people incarcerated. So But this time period saw the development of a lot of really interesting theories, and a lot of them we still, are still kind of mainstream theories today. Routine activity theory is a big one that's discussed a lot. This theory essentially says that crime occurs when you have an offender, the absence of guardians, and a suitable target kind of all converging in the same time and same place. And this was the basis for what we call situational crime prevention. And that's just a fancy term for things like lock your doors. If you lock the doors of your car, then it's less likely someone will come into it and steal your stuff. If you put bars on your windows, that will keep more burglars out of your house, because they'll probably go to a house that's easier to rob or burglarize that doesn't have bars. And that's what situational crime prevention is. Also things like, don't go jogging at 11 o'clock at night alone. That's probably not a great idea. It just makes you ripe to become a victim. So those are all ideas of situational crime prevention, and all of that comes out of routine activity theory. And so you're probably familiar with a lot of those ideas. You just didn't know what it was called. Some other ideas that also emerged in the conservative era are what we call rational choice theories and perceptual deterrence theory. Deterrence theory is a very old theory that comes from the classical school that looks at our decision-making processes being based on costs and benefits. Perceptual deterrence is a newer improvement on that theory, which basically says it's not really actual costs and benefits that matter when you're making a decision. It's the perceived costs and benefits, because people can perceive things wildly different than reality. And so if someone thinks committing a crime is going to provide a really big benefit and cost very little, they may go ahead and do it, but they could be very wrong. And so measuring people's perceptions has actually become more important. And there are some new kind of areas in criminology. We're not going to spend a lot of time on these newer areas in this class, because those are really kind of more suited to maybe a graduate class on this topic. But just know that there are a lot of new areas coming out that are kind of branches of existing theory, and new ideas are coming up all the time. And the only way we see which ones are any good is by researching and testing them, and see which ones hold up to the scrutiny of research. So looking at criminological theory in the 21st century, we've got really a big mix of old ideas and new ideas. And we've kind of kept the old ideas that work and mixed in some new ideas to try and improve them. And really, if you look at the large body of criminological theory, there really is no definite ideological or political slant to any of it. It's pretty broad. I mean, there are a lot of conservative ideas, there are some more liberal ideas, and there's kind of a mixture of all of it. A lot of the policies that we look at right now tend to favor kind of middle of the road types of reforms. I guess this can be good or bad, but there's not much of an appetite, especially among politicians, for sweeping radical changes. Not too many people are interested in being that person. But usually reforms are more, they're modest, they're kind of middle of the road, and we just make gradual changes as time moves on. One of the biggest changes in recent years, like in the last 10 years or so in criminology, is the resurgence of what we call the biosocial perspective. And if you remember earlier, I said back in the early 1800s, Lombroso started off with some biological types of experiments, and it didn't work out too well. Criminologists have really shunned the biological perspective for many, many years, hundreds of years. And it's just been in recent years, now that we have the technology to really look at this stuff and look at genes and genetics and hormones in the brain and stuff like that, that we've actually started to see a lot of research in this area, and a lot of it actually has some promise, and there are some good ideas coming out of that field. And that's something we'll talk about towards the end of the course. But keep in mind that that is a very legitimate area of study these days. So just to wrap this up, as we go through this course and through this book, we're going to talk about all these different efforts that have been made to explain why crime occurs. And keep in mind that the causes of crime can be in a variety of places. It might be something, a physical characteristic that causes us to act a certain way. It could be a psychological or mental characteristic, or it could be something in the social context around us in our environment. And there are people out there who usually like to say, oh, it's all this or it's all that. The answers usually don't lie in extremes. It's probably a mixture of all of these things. But the question that we try to answer is which ones are the most important, and which ones can we actually change to help people out. There's not generally a lot we can do about someone's physical makeup, but we might be able to change their social context or their relationships, and so we have to work with the things that we are able to change. But it's always important to remember as we go through this course that sometimes when you talk about theory, you kind of get bogged down in all the ideas and maybe start wondering, well, what's the point of all this? The point of all of it is that theory is what leads to policy, and policy is really what criminology is all about, because you can study theory for decades, but if you don't apply it to anything and it doesn't make any difference in society, then all you're really engaged in is just a fun mental exercise. So, and others might say that it's not really that fun. But, so we have to remember that theories matter because they tend to be what drives our policy-making decisions when it comes to actually addressing the crime problem. So that's it for Chapter 1. If you have any questions, get in touch with me and I'll talk to you soon.